Hi, and welcome to Footnotes. I'm Tshego Mosiane, founder and lead strategist here at Reconnected Group Africa. Footnotes is our information series where we break down strategic issues that investors, executives, and entrepreneurs operating within Africa will eventually have to face. Each episode focuses on a specific topic that's shaping how business is done on the continent. Understand what matters, why it matters, and how to position yourself early. Today's topic is Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR. First of all, what is EPR? Over the last few years, EPR has moved from being a narrow environmental compliance issue to a strategic business operation. It was mainly applied to things like mining and raw natural resources. But now EU regulators have expanded it to apply to things like textiles, packaging, electronics, and consumer goods. By expanding where EPR applies, this is basically the EU regulators' attempt to shift the responsibility for waste and end-of-life product management back onto the producers. The EPR regulations now require businesses and manufacturers to consider the full life cycle of the product. Now, we first started seeing these new regulations in the news, but most so people almost demonizing it as if it's another layer of bureaucratic nonsense from the EU regulators. But if you are a business operating in Africa wanting to become more of a global supplier, this could actually serve as a competitive advantage and a financial lever for your business. Because now investors are paying more attention to sustainability data, global supply chains, and responsible sourcing. So if you can use the EPR regulations to your benefit, just like major mining and natural resource companies have, it could actually unlock a lot of opportunity for you and your business. Part of our work here at Reconnected Group is monitoring updates in regulations around the world that could unlock new markets for African businesses. So this was definitely on our radar. In order to better understand it from a regulatory and compliance level, though, we reached out to Carlyn Davies. She is an environmental lawyer with over a decade of experience in the mining sector, having worked at ENS Africa, which is one of the biggest law firms in South Africa. In this conversation, we focus on how EPR is evolving and how businesses, primarily African businesses, can approach it proactively in order to gain a competitive advantage.
Yeah, but thank you so much again for making time to talk to me today. The reason I wanted to talk to you today was about, so I've been watching the EPR conversation in the EU, and like you actually say quite often, is that there's always going to be waste, so that there's always going to be new regulatory frameworks. And I think out of all regions in the world, I find the EU's approach the most interesting because they don't minimize or as much as other places the impact on commerce and business. For so long, environmentalism in general has been separated from commerce, or when it's been included, it's been more of like a destructive conversation. I think a lot of like the lab grown diamond ideology, I call it an ideology, that in concept is great, but in practice, when you apply it to commerce, it's a consolidation of wealth to like maybe 10 companies that grow lab grown diamonds away from like economies that depend on it, like Botswana, right? Now, I know this doesn't have anything to do directly with the EPR, but it kind of connected the dots in my brain of like how people like that, people with truly sustainable products, if that makes sense, can use things like the EPR as a branding leverage and things like that. So that's kind of like the main source of the conversation today. So I'd like to first unpack, let's say, what is the EPR actually is, and how is it being rolled out in the EU and globally that like makes it such an interesting or impactful legislation?
So EPR is Extended Producer Responsibility, and essentially what it deals with is just making the producer or the generator of a product basically responsible, it's in the word, for the full life cycle of a product. So from the start and the design of a product all the way through to most likely the disposal of that product. And why it's important is because for decades, maybe even centuries, a lot of the products that we as consumers consume, we have to deal with the disposal. So if you think of simple things like your soda bottles, we consume the liquid and then we kind of throw it away. Although there was a kind of basic take back example, and you could send your bottles back to the actual stores and get some money back. That in itself is like a basic example of an extended producer responsibility program. And before that, it was basically just consume your item, and particularly with clothing and even food, consume, dispose, and then often people say we don't know where away is, but we just throw it away. And similarly, the producers and the manufacturers, they've never had to deal with the cost or deal with the result of their product being disposed. And so with extended producer responsibility, it's just bringing all of those costs back into the producer's realm. And so they have to then think of how they design their products to make sure that things like circularity, that it can actually be used for as long as possible. And all of these actually fit into, in South Africa, we have a waste hierarchy. And the idea is that you try and avoid waste. And if you can't avoid waste, then you manage waste. If you can't manage waste, then you must minimize its impact on the environment. And so the EPR system fits into that because obviously you want to avoid. So if you can design a product that will last and will have as little impact on the environment through disposal as possible, and then you're kind of achieving that waste hierarchy. So it's very much like a management tool to ensure that products aren't just made and disposed of, and we deal with these mountains of waste. And then from the EU perspective, extended producer responsibility will now apply to textiles. So all member states will have to implement legislation in their jurisdictions, and they'll have to basically have an EPR system for any textiles that are on their market. So that's whether it's produced in Europe or not.
Yeah, it's funny that you mention it because I'm actually in January. Yeah, I'm releasing the latest report, but I do psychographic reports on helping people better understand the African consumer. And like, to me, the circular economy part is like why a lot of brands fail, is the fact that we can't reuse their packaging. And it's like just a natural inclination for you to reuse packaging here. So I think that's like an interesting point that could also form part of like EPR points, if that's what we're going to call it, like EPR assessment, positive EPR assessments, because it's one of those things that I think a lot of non-African brands don't usually think of. Asian brands have very disposable product packaging that aren't very reusable. So does like Western, like US and EU products. So I think like just that virtue of like, I make the joke that like we buy like pine gel, not for the pine gel, but so that we could have the tub for every other thing except pine gel. So I think that's like very interesting that like what is already natural to a lot of consumers here is basically being like codified in regulation. So even a lot of the times when I hear people talking about like, like you were saying, that there's like a lot of debate around like especially in Europe about how are we supposed to implement these things, and I'm like, well, this is very simple. Like I do this, all the time. But I guess then the question would be like, what would taking that responsibility look like?
So with Europe, they are so many regulations, and there are other regulations that will also feed into the EPR regulations. But with EPR, and I was on a webinar where they were explaining, it was a group of sort of a project team basically who has implemented EPR systems in other jurisdictions, and they were just walking through possible problems or discussions. And the point of the webinar was that now that each and every member state, every country in Europe is going to have to implement something in their jurisdiction, there may be sort of issues that arise. And so it's difficult to say what each member state will require, but ultimately it all has to reach or agree to certain aims and goals of that waste framework directive.
I love fashion. I first wanted to work in fashion, but I think one of the biggest gripes that even I had working in fashion was like the dishonesty in the marketing in African fashion. And I think this will flip the African fashion narrative over if people learn how to use this correctly, is that now we will know that the certain big brands are very low quality, and I just wonder how could the underdogs of the African fashion industry, people that don't showcase in Joburg and Cape Town, they might showcase in Soweto and Daum. How do they flip the narrative where it's been so much about brand and storytelling and things like that? But if now, in order to get into the market, never mind get into a store or get into a fashion week, just enter the market, you have to be EPR compliable. I guess it's how can more craftsmen or more manufacturers, more producers use that to kind of break through that bottleneck?
The design of the EPR system ultimately is, as you say, there's a division between art and business. And if we look to fast fashion, ultra fast fashion, even luxury brands in Europe, the issue and the reason why things like EPR now exist is because it's been treated like a business, taking profit as far as possible, pushing down your costs as far as possible. And the overproduction, overconsumption, all of those aspects have led to the need for an EPR system. So when you have manufacturers just, producing as much as they can just to get the price of an item as low as possible, not really caring whether it's sold or if it's destroyed or if it ends up on the beaches in Ghana, that has been the way that business has functioned for quite a while. So it's been a while, and that sort of obsession with newness and accessibility to the democratization of fashion has really pushed and led a lot of the changes in fashion. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I still think back to growing up, there wasn't the variety or the access to clothing that there is now. And my family, we would save up and we would get one item a year type of thing. Whereas now you have the opportunity to constantly buy. So I think it's moved from, and this is probably a debate for another time, but it's moved from that art form and that type of creative expression to just companies trying to sell as much as they can. Mm-hmm. And the result of that is an impact on the environment. So too much of something is never a good thing. And so the fact that these regulations are coming into operation is, again, it's mainly aimed at those massive companies who are just taking advantage of the system. And I totally agree with you that on the flip side, companies who are ready or who have already built their business more sort of based on traditions, on craft, on slow fashion, if you want to call it that, they have an opportunity, because essentially what the EPR system is aiming to do is what they are already doing. Mm. So it's creating clothes in a way that is far more cognizant of your impact. And it might not be that that was the aim for a designer. You know, you maybe didn't start out thinking, I just want to be kind to the environment and create natural fiber-based clothes and quality goods that will last through generations. As you mentioned, I think it's more a way of life. It's just always been how we live type of thing, and wanting to have items that you can pass down through generations, not necessarily because, you loved that item and it was really special, but often just out of necessity. Like you can't afford, again, like there wasn't a lot available, so you couldn't really afford to walk into a store and just buy new things. So the care in looking after an item was far more important, and still is far more important. So brands who focus on fashion as an art form, fashion as craft, fashion as cultural expression and storytelling, I think storytelling is still really important, have an opportunity to essentially show how the system should be. And that's what EPR aims to recreate. So I think using what you're already doing, and again, like I always go back to recording and being transparent about your information, that really is key. And that will be the difficulty almost in some of the EPR systems, because Europe already relies on things like certifications. But the problem with certification systems, especially those based in Europe, is that it's really expensive for Africans. So a way to avoid the need for certification, it's just really ensuring that your recording of information and your transparency behind your brand is on point. And it takes a bit more work, but it can only arm you in going into European markets.
I think someone who does that really well is Makosa Laduma and his family. And because I've seen one of their impact reports, and it does include, because that's in one of your written answers, you said things like checking how much water you use, the job turnover, the median income of the area, if it's gone up or gone down since you've opened the factory. So I think that's why, a lot of times when I speak to aspiring designers, the question is why is this person doing so well? But I think that's part of, because Makosa is not design based, right? He's not always putting out a new collection of silhouettes and, handbags and things. It's highly focused on the craft. And in many ways, I think that supply chain of his that he's built is his competitive advantage. And that's where the story comes from, rather than creating a world, how a lot of branding advice on the internet is create the world that you want to live in type of thing. I think he's someone that does it really, really well, and is a great example of how far it can go. And not just in textile. I know we're both fashion lovers, but now that we are more of an internationally competitive market, BRICS did the things that it needed to do and everything. How do you think more African people should approach entering foreign markets, especially the EU, the luxury market and everything?
I think, again, as you say, it's in your systems approach and how your business is run. I think so much of it is just built on more your processes and what and how you're doing things. And I think if that is sort of on the right track, and you're, again, I know I sound like a broken record coming back to recording just how you do things, and from your water use and your waste use and the people that you employ. I think once you have that process in place, it's really hard to shake. So it's almost like your foundation is your most important point. And you can't really tell someone how to do it. I suppose it's unique to their business. And building, also a really important thing is building a customer base. And I think when you're genuine and authentic and transparent about who you are and what you do as a brand, I think you build that reputation, just as you've said with Makosa, and then sort sort of going from strength to strength from there, you can only succeed. And I think having that foundation and that truth to entering a market in Europe is something that's very important, because you need that base and that solid sort of construction almost of your business to enter into new markets. So you almost become unshakable. So spend time on building your processes and what you do and how you do it.
Okay, so here are the 3 strategic takeaways that matter for anyone trying to build a business or investing in a business in Africa. Number 1, EPR can be used as a genuine sustainability practice, not just a compliance checkbox. Businesses that design these systems early tend to face lower long-term costs and less regulatory friction because they already have the data quantified, instead of relying heavily on branding and public perception. You can show your sustainability and your impact through quantifiable data that you've been tracking. 2, the data itself is also an asset. It could be used as a way to attract investors. It could be a way to unlock grant funding. It could also be the backbone of building other products and technologies because you have quantifiable existing data that you have been tracking. But there's a 2-in-1 benefit, as that the data itself is valuable outside of just the products or the services that your businesses offer. And number 3, traceability is becoming a huge competitive advantage. As consumers become more conscious and more paranoid of what is in the products that we buy, where the money is going, who is profiting off of what we consume, knowing exactly where every single aspect of a product comes from will be a huge competitive advantage. Also, in markets like the EU, where regulations are becoming stricter around end of product life as well as product ingredient, that means that consumer capital will also become more selective. And businesses that understand this early are better positioned to not just succeed within Africa, but globally in coming decades. So, yeah, okay, thank you so much for watching this Footnotes. If you are an investor, entrepreneur, or executive in Africa looking to build more resilient long-term strategies, definitely reach out to us at Reconnected Group Africa and find out how we can help you.